Australia's Labor Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and Redbridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Good morning and welcome back, Curtinistas. Very special episode of Curtin's Cast, episode 50. Welcome, Kung Fu Kos Samaras.
Good morning, sir.
It's great to have you in the studio this morning, celebrating the big 50. Listeners, my name's Nick Dyrenfurth, Executive Director of the John Curtin Research Centre. I'm joined by Kos Samaras, Head Honcho of Redbridge, and today we are talking about Bob Hawke, Bob Hawke's legacy. 40 years on, we're still talking about Hawke. Last week, Kos, we were talking about a Hawke-like figure bestriding the South Australian and national political landscape, Peter Malinauskas. But it does feel like even now we measure Australian governments against the standard, the gold standard, to borrow a line from a book we're discussing today, of Bob Hawke. Every time a PM talks about reform, about that dreaded word productivity, which you love so much, Kosy, consensus, political courage, the comparison is never far away. The question that nags is why? Is it because Hawke was really exceptional, a once-in-a-generation political leader who managed to combine electoral dominance with deep structural reform? Or is it because we look back on the era with a very strong tinge of nostalgia? The world of Hawke and his sidekick Paul Keating does feel like a literal lifetime ago. And to help us unpack Hawke, the man, the myth, the mythology, we are joined by a fabulous guest this morning, Professor Frank Bongiorno, one of Australia's leading historians of politics, culture and society, and a public intellectual in his own right. Frank is Professor of History at the University of Canberra and the inaugural Director of the Vice-Chancellor's Centre for Public Ideas. We might know the Vice-Chancellor.
We do.
Of the University of Canberra. Professor Shorten.
Yes.
I was up there in Canberra listening to Professor Shorten, because, and I'll let you in a little secret. Whilst he perorated on the Australian university sector and made a bold claim for a sovereign yes. education tax, a literal earthquake struck the room there at the National Press Club. Frank was there, and Frank is the author of a string of major works on Australian political life, particularly the 1980s, including the book called The 1980s and Dreamers and Schemers, a sweeping political history of Australia. He once co-wrote a cheeky little history of the Australian Labor Party with one of the hosts in this room. More of a medium history, the second edition. And his latest edited collection is Gold Standard, which takes a fresh and critical look at the Hawke government and its enduring reputation. Frank, it's wonderful to have you on Curtin's Cast. Welcome.
Oh, thanks, Nick, and hi, Kos. Delighted to be here.
Frank, let's start with a question which may be on the minds of listeners. Why? Why another book on Bob Hawke? There are many biographies, Troy Bramston, David Day, perhaps his most recent biographers, many books devoted to studying the man, the legend, and his governments. Why another book on Bob Hawke?
Yeah, good question. Well, it was done, Nick, for the 40th anniversary, and we wanted to have a glance back. We also thought that we're now at a point where it is genuinely history, isn't it? There was always this sense, even when I was doing the book on the 80s, a bit over a decade ago, that, a lot of people thought, is that really history? That seems too recent, all the rest of it. Well, the entire sort of archival record, if you like, the official archival record for the Hawke government is not all of it actually, not all of it's accessible, but the bulk of things like cabinet documents and departmental files and all the rest of it are now available. Hawke himself, of course, passed away in 2019, just on the eve of the election of that year. There have been a number of biographies, as you say. I think, on the other hand, probably less close study of the government itself. We don't have, for instance, a book-length study of the Hawke Government, which I think is quite interesting. This is an edited collection which I brought together with Carolyn, Holbrook and Joshua Black,
Yes,
two
very
other
fine
historians.
Very fine historians.
Indeed. And, we got together, some veterans of that government, others who were in the public service at the time, academics, both of the time and in the period since, to try and bring together, an evaluation more of the government, I think, than of Bob Hawke in particular. Of course, Hawke as a political leader, Hawke as a kind of folk hero does stalk the book, as you'd expect, and particularly perhaps in my own chapter, which is on winning elections. But it is an attempt to focus on the government more than, I think, on Hawke as an individual.
Yeah, you've got some wonderful contributors there, Frank. I mentioned Troy Bramston before. He's there. Michelle Grattan, always have to introduce as the doyen of the Australian Press Gallery. Peter Yu, looking at the disappointment, reflecting on some of the disappointments of First Nation Australians. Gareth Evans, Ian McPhee, Barry Cassidy, who was a staffer in the Hawke government, and as was Craig Emerson, who became a cabinet minister in the Rudd governments. Always have to the Rudd Gillard governments. I've sort of critiqued some in the Labor Party adopted an overly nostalgic view of those years, Frank. But I actually think over the last decade or so, there has been a gradual, not revisionism, but an understanding that whilst Laborites should look back with pride in those years and rightly understand it as a gold standard government, that the idea that you could simply redo the Hawke-Keating years and the microeconomic reform in this digital age, in this AI age, is almost impossible.
Could I beg to differ on that?
You can, Kos. That's
yes,
the point of a podcast.
That's the point of the podcast, isn't it? I would argue that the Hawke and Keating government knew what was coming down the pipeline for a lot of people that they felt they needed to represent. And the reforms they embarked on were about setting up some of those safety nets to buffer the working class Australians from globalisation, right? And one would argue that in today's environment, it's exactly what is needed. And the one criticism I will make of the current government is that it's clearly can see significant changes in the economy heading down the pipeline, but is not embarking on the same level of reform that we saw under Hawke.
Oh, I think we're on a uni ticket there, Cosy.
Yes.
My argument a decade ago, now feeling really old, Frank, when I wrote a series of articles on 1983 and all that, was this idea that sort of time was frozen there in 1983. It wasn't like the Hawke government ran around and Whitlam government ran around talking about wanting to relive the glory years of the 1940s, even though John Curtin was Bob Hawke's political hero. Frank, do you think the sense of nostalgia has softened judgment on Hawke and his administration? Because we look back, I guess, with nostalgia, with rose-tinted glasses, but it was the era was actually far more contested than people give it credit for.
Yeah, that's true, Nick. I mean, Gold Standard, as the title of this book, has a question mark after it, very deliberately. We took the phrase itself actually from Gareth Evans's cabinet diaries about a bit over a decade ago. Gareth published his cabinet diaries that sort of run from about late 1984 through to towards the end of 1986, I think, and right at the outset, his introduction to those, he says, the Hawke government's often considered a gold standard. It didn't always seem that way from the inside, he added, which I think was a really important observation. The messiness, the contestation, the missteps, all of those kinds of things tend to be kind of tidied up, don't they, by nostalgia when people look back on a period. And in a lot of ways, that was the starting point for the work I did on the 1980s. When I set out to write that book now 13, 14 years ago, it was the ways in which the 80s had come, I thought, to be treated as a gold standard rather too easily. So I was delighted when, sort of in the midst of writing all that, there was also a bit of a gentle challenge from Gareth Evans to that idea. I looked at the elections, of course, of those years, and it was and remains, the most successful federal Labor government in terms of longevity and winning, one election after another. But of course, each election was certainly after 1983, at any rate, each election was, a fairly closely run thing in all sorts of ways. And, some of the issues that we're dealing with at the moment, the disaffection of the outer suburbs, were the kinds of things that people were talking about actually especially by 1987 with respect to the Hawke government. There's also, of course, the myth that, its reform program was kind of waved through by the opposition at the time. This is utter nonsense. Some of it was things like the dollar float, but taxation reform was hotly contested. There were bitter debates over things like immigration, over Indigenous rights, Aboriginal rights. Medicare, of course, was opposed by the Liberal and National parties at election after election, right through to 1993. So, yes, a much more contested, a much untidier history, I think, than the more nostalgic view gives us. But the thing I'm struck by, and I think I quote John Dawkins at one point in this book, that there was a genuine sense of purpose and mission that attached to that government almost from the very outset. And people compliment it on the talent of its ministers, and it was a very talented government, I think. But more than that, I think there was a genuine sense of direction and purpose that came out of a sense, as Kos was saying, really, that things were changing, that there needed to be a constructive response to globalisation and the way that the world was changing to a rather arthritic economy, I think, by the time you get to the early 80s with the recession and, the sense of a kind of cul-de-sac. So that I think is a very important, or was a very important resource for that government.
Yeah, I was maybe getting caught up in the nostalgia there, because I recall the left of the Labor Party jumping up and down furiously during the 1980s when, there were policy manoeuvres on tariffs, on privatisation, deregulation, which flew in the face of Labor tradition. It spawned a whole canon, Frank, in terms of academics and labour rights, debating whether the government had departed from the Labor tradition, whether it's understood as Labourism or socialism.
I mean, the point is that the left at the time, yes, definitely opposed many of those reforms, particularly around tariffs. But when you look back on it, and you look back on it through the lens of history, even if you are of that ideological position, you can confirm that, well, actually they did the right thing, right? And so my point is that it's easy to basically oppose things because you think that they are accelerating what is going globally, when in reality what they're doing is actually putting in barriers to protect the people that are going to be most vulnerable.
Correct. I'm having some fun with you this morning, Kos.
Yes,
but Frank, Hawke actually, you're right, they actually had come to, now not everything they didn't promise this fully fledged reform agenda when they went to the 1983 election. I think we should be very clear about that. But Hawke had actually come to office as a fully formed political figure. He'd been in public life for decades, and he'd actually laid out a lot of this thinking in the Boyer lecture in the decade previously. So in some ways, the agenda that he and his reformist treasurer, Paul Keating, picked up, it wasn't a surprise.
No, it wasn't. Well, there are aspects of it that I think did surprise people, but you're quite right, Nick, that he'd been, yes, there were the Boyer lectures. He'd also been on a kind of structural adjustment committee with John Crawford in the late 70s, which had, gently pushed in the direction of at least reform of the, serious reform of the tariff system, and pointing out that it was quite, obviously going to be unsustainable to simply have a high tariff regime going into the future. So there was certainly, indications, I guess, in, Hawke as a public figure, as someone who'd intervened in public debates, as you say, for many, many years. I mean, he was talking about things like productivity, actually, well ahead of his own government. So all that's true, but you're quite right. Go back to that first, that speech on the 16th of February, 1983, in the Opera House, and you would imagine that this was, really going to be another Keynesian government. There's certainly not a single hint there of reducing protection. Indeed, the exact opposite. That, as with Malcolm Fraser, the idea was you don't do this in the middle of a recession. So yes, in a lot of ways, it was a government whose program really unfolded, I think, over the years ahead. They began really, financial reform was right up front at the beginning. That they move on to other areas. Tariff reform, I think, really begins to take off more from, probably about the time of the Banana Republic crisis, as it was called, about 1986, from then on. And then, of course, industrial relations reform, labour market reform tended to come out of the late 1980s. So, there's a lot of discussion now about Albanese. Is the government too cautious? Is it too timid? It is worth remembering, I think, that the Hawke government also took several terms in order to implement many of the kinds of things that it was committed to.
Indeed. I'm reminded too, Frank, that, when Hawke tried to add the term reconciliation to the themes of recovery and reconstruction, Neville Wran famously out of the famous outburst, which we can't repeat.
The adjective's a bit rude. Yeah,
the adjective's a bit rude. The greedy beep just want a tax cut. If they wanted spirituality, they'd join the Hare Krishnas.
That's right.
But it does give us a sense. Hawke came to power in '83. There had been nearly a decade of division and rancour in Australian politics. Again, whilst we can mythologise consensus, and you're right, people often talk about the Accord. There was no accord with the business sector in Australia, and a lot of the agenda was actually opposed. Retrospectively, you have people on the centre-right and the right-wing commentariat talk up the Hawke-Keating reform era, but they actually opposed a lot of the agenda. They opposed actually a lot of the pro-business aspects of the agenda, particularly around opening up the banking and finance sector. That was actually deeply unpopular, particularly amongst the Melbourne establishment. And the other area, Frank, too, which is hard to avoid comparisons today with the rise of One Nation, was multiculturalism and immigration and Australian identity. And Hawke very famously took a stand when, there was a nasty divisive debate opened up in the mid-1980s by the historian Geoffrey Blaney, who was running around talking about the Asianisation of Australia, and John Howard, who was then opposition leader, thought it would be advantageous to seek political mileage out of that. And, Hawke actually stood up to him in Parliament.
It was fairly wise, given about that time, 1983 would have been the first election nationally where we would have seen the full weight of that 1960s migration wave. It took on average about 15, 20 years before most of these migrants that arrived in the 1960s actually ended up on the voters' roll. Contrary to popular belief, people think it's immediate. It's a lot quicker these days, but back then, good example is my mum. She arrived here in 1966. She became an Australian citizen, encouraged by the dismissal, but didn't realise you actually had to go and enrol to vote. Again, the systems weren't in place like they are today. And her first election, federal election, was 1983. Yeah.
It's funny that Frank might want to talk on this as well. My dad actually didn't become a citizen, and he'd lived in this country since December 1949. He and my grandmother got, I think they got a week or so of the Chifley Labor government, but he'd just been a British citizen up until 1987. Frank might want to talk to that. We often think about the Hawke government as just being about economic reform, but He was actually sort of forced and prompted to actually finally become an Australian citizen.
Yeah, they closed the voting loophole, I think, in 1984. And in fact, it's a reminder actually of one of the reasons why I think this was actually a great government. That we've talked here about economic reform and those sorts of areas, industrial relations. But it's multiple agendas that is striking, and in 1984, a massive overhaul of the electoral system that was still with us in all sorts of ways. That the mention, for instance, of party affiliation on ballot papers dates from 1984. Above the line and below the line voting for the Senate dates from those electoral reforms. Indeed, the Australian Electoral Commission in its current form is also.
Yes,
I mean, it was
that's the big
successor.
one.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the big one.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right, Nick. I mean, on the immigration one, yeah, there were blow-ups, a couple of them in the 80s. There was the 1984 one, and yes, actually Peacock was leader at that stage, but then yes, John Howard later, of course, also kind of ignited a big one over Asian immigration. I think Margaret Thatcher might have been in the country at the time, and there's always been a suggestion that could have been some sort of encouragement to a bit of a hard line. But it's an issue. Asian immigration in particular is an issue right through the 1980s. Again, kind of forgotten, I think, in a lot of the nostalgia about that period, but it was unquestionably a source of anxiety for old Australia. And it was something that Hawke, I think on the whole, managed, certainly came to manage quite expertly. I mean, certainly he lowered the temperature very successfully, as well as getting one over his opponents in 1988. The 84 debate, I think, was a much more difficult one, where I think the government was never quite able to get it under control. The immigration minister at the time, Stuart West, wasn't very sure-footed, I think, in his handling of the issue. So, yeah, but it's a really important theme in the period, is the sense of a changing Australia, and the fact that, people don't just automatically adjust to this. It's something the government does have to manage in the 80s. Again, there may well be all sorts of lessons in the present for how that was done.
Expansion of the parliament.
That was another one in 84.
That's right.
Another one in 84.
And that was, again, recognition of a country that its political centre had moved from what I would define as I wouldn't say entirely regional, but there was a lot more political power in the regional electorates. And what 1984 did is shift that to the urban environment. And I would argue that shift had laid the groundwork to the world we're now operating in, where urban politics matters so much.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess the other shift that we've seen, Kos, in terms of electoral alignments too since then, is many of the kind of larger regional centres, particularly down there in Victoria, actually, that were very hotly contested between the major parties, have quite frankly become, Labor territory.
Yes.
So there's been that I think political shift has been very important actually to the Labor Party as well.
Yeah.
The book really suggests that one of the real lessons isn't actually policy, but it's the art of politics and administration. So if we're going to talk about the gold standard there, that's really what we're getting at. There was a sense that cabinet was run super effectively. The talent in cabinet was quite extraordinary, really quite extraordinary. The depth and the breadth. You had people like Peter Walsh. I think it was a wheat farmer from WA. Did Susan Ryan come in? Was she there in the first ministry?
She was, yeah, 83, yeah.
You've got Gareth there, obviously Keating, and it battered really deep.
Brian Howe.
And indeed such a talented cabinet and ministry that we need to remind ourselves that, yes, Brian Howe, Kim Beazley, even John Dawkins, also Neil Blewett, none of these were in cabinet at the beginning. I mean, that's how good they were in the ministry, but they actually weren't in the inner cabinet, which I think, reminds us of just how talented this lot were. It was a government that had been very shaped by the Vietnam War, was full of, anti-Vietnam War figures, and very shaped by the trauma of the dismissal, really. It was, I think, a government that was made harder, steelier, by a sense that the other side don't play by the rules. I think they were very shaped by the events of 1975. Some of them, of course, had been in Parliament at that time. John Button, for instance, had been there since 1974. Others, were sort of staffers or in a range of roles. Gareth Evans was an advisor, I think, back then. But I think that was a very formative experience for this government. It's worth thinking about, what are the equivalent formative experiences for the present government, because I think that often helps you explain the ways in which they see the world and the way in which they respond to particular issues.
I would argue that, the current generation probably shaped by more what happened at the end of that government, as in the Hawke-Keating government cycle, which was that internal instability. I would say the modernisation of how media cover internal division and, the struggle between Hawke and Keating for the leadership. That, I think, it formed some bad habits for the next generation. And we saw that writ large with the Gillard-Rudd years, because basically that generation were the staffers, right, and they took all the wrong lessons out of that. That your problems are solved by removing a leader, and so on. Now we can all debate about whether that swap was worth it or not, but it certainly did lay the groundwork for some very bad behaviour in years to come.
The other really striking parallel we saw a week ago, that seismic election in South Australia. The other parallel is with the dysfunction and disorder on the conservative centre-right of politics. And, the task falls to us historians, Frank, to actually remember things like the push for Joe for Canberra, Joe Bjelkeson for Canberra, and the impact that, divisions on the conservative side of politics had on the Hawke government's longevity.
Yeah, and I think it was fortunate in the divisions on the other side of politics, and also I think a sense of bewilderment around policy that you found on the political right during the 1980s. I mean, there was an emerging kind of idea on the political right that the Fraser government had kind of blown it, that it had a great opportunity to reform the country and had failed to do so. I mean, a lot of that argument was pretty self-serving, particularly when it was coming from people like John Howard, who'd been there as treasurer through so many of those years. But that kind of idea was also, kind of in some ways an own goal for the Liberals during the 1980s, because I think it meant that they really struggled to work out, where they stood, and particularly as the Labor government was obviously doing things that were very unfamiliar for Labor governments. That sort of, provoked a rightward movement, I think, on a whole range of issues that really culminates in John Howard's leadership of the party between 1985 and 1989. And yes, you had the circus in 1987 involving Joe Bjelke-Petersen that probably cost Howard that election. It was in a lot of ways, a pretty close run election, but certainly it didn't help the coalition. In fact, one shouldn't even call it the coalition, because the coalition broke during that period. The parties at least officially fought that election separately, the Liberals and the Nationals. And then, of course, you get even to 1990 and, you get someone like Peter Schack, who was, I think, the Shadow Health spokesman, turning up to a media conference and basically saying, we know that the public doesn't trust the Coalition on Health, and I don't blame them. So and they still had no policy, basically. So, I think Labor was fortunate in those divisions. And to go back to a point I think you were making earlier, Nick, too, there were quite significant divisions in the business community during that period as well. And I think Labor benefited from those. It was able to cultivate parts of the business community. Others, it was quite willing to take on or to ignore. Hawke, I think, played that game very successfully during the 1980s. And of course, that drew on networks that he'd been developing since the 1960s as a major figure in the ACTU.
I think the business community, even during that time, was evolving just as rapid as the political world was, really. If you think about what was occurring in the economy at the time, a lot of the sort of what we'll define as old money was being pushed aside by the entrepreneurial class. The economy was flush with money, obviously driven by debt, as in personal debt. You think of Ellen Bond, Christopher Skase, lots of high-profile, colourful characters, destabilising what you could best describe was an Australian economy that was disruptors. Yes, the Australian economy before that time was, basically we were a provincial backwater.
Yeah, no, I think that sense of an economy going through a period of enormous turbulence was very powerful. And yes, it's partly facilitated by the government's deregulation, especially of the financial sector. The dollar's floated. If you go back to the newspapers at the time, on the same page, I think, front page of the Australian, there's the float of the dollar and there's John Elliott's takeover of Carlton United Breweries in 1983, in which he brings in a vast sum of money from overseas. It's a part of the story, actually, because the flows of capital were at least at that moment, being significantly influenced by that massive takeover bid. So I think that dramatises the way in which the political story is so entangled in that larger story, as Kos says, of the entrepreneurs and what's happening to capitalism during this period.
Why does reform feel so much more difficult today, Frank? Bearing in mind that we should be careful about nostalgia, it was a lot harder than people think. There wasn't some neat bipartisanship, and it appears to have been the case. This is an argument being put forward by Paul Kelly on the centre right to George Megalogenis on the centre left, that for over 2 decades now, really since the late second term Howard government, reform has appeared to be so difficult at a national level. And I guess that's another discussion we can have, is there is so much focus on federal politics. It actually leads us to, and we got a reminder about this during the COVID years, it actually leads us to forget about how much power constitutionally the states still have.
Yeah, it's an important point about the states, Nick. I mean, I think we're in a very we're entering a period of really significant subordination by the time you get to the 80s. Bjelke-Petersen benefited obviously from, essentially coal mining in the Bowen Basin, and they took massive railway receipts and royalties from that. And in a lot of ways, the kind of autonomy he was able to show in the 80s owed a lot to those particular circumstances. But in general, the scope, I think, for policy innovation at the state level was probably narrowing, particularly around economic policy. State governments are more important today, I think, that they have greater borrowing capacity. They have often been experimenters, I think, in a way that was certainly happening in the 80s, but perhaps was a bit less salient. Look, I don't have any simple answers. You two probably would have a better sense of why reform's becoming much more difficult now, or has become much more difficult. I think the media environment is much harder. I mean, Keating would talk about if you could basically, get a handful of journalists on side on a particular issue, you kind of had the media. In the 1980s, during the time he was treasurer. I mean, clearly that's no longer the case.
This is something Kos and I have talked about a lot. The aim of the government was to win the morning papers and the evening the news, and we have
pretty much
far more fragmented.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about back then, you had John Laws. If you could get John Laws on side. If you had, as Frank just mentioned, a few of the major Canberra Press Gallery journos on side, you squared off the story of the day. You pretty much controlled the narrative. Today, well, there are 100 different channels, fragmented media, fragmented tribal behaviours. It's vastly different. Vastly different.
So I think that I agree. I mean, I think that's certainly a large part of the story. Are there other factors? Yes, there probably are. I think there is a kind of an argument about the reduced sort of policy and advisory capacity of the Australian public service, reduced autonomy, I think, which again, the Hawke government, if we're talking about legacies, I mean, it must carry some of the can, I think, for that problem, that the reforms that, sort of occurred from about 1987 sort of did pave the way, I think, for much more radical and damaging things that would happen under Howard. But I think that's also probably a part of the issue. The current government does deserve, I think, some credit for attempting to enable the public service to a greater extent, to shift, I guess, the lines of advice more towards the APS, to increase its capacity. So, I mean, that's a welcome development, I think, but also an overdue one. And I suspect that some of the challenges of reform have been related to that.
And one of the other great challenges of reform, another parallel here with the Albanese government, is the defeat of the voice. And I think it's widely accepted, Frank, that, whilst there are many advances, certainly for Hawke personally, there were disappointments around Indigenous policy and First Nations people. I mean, Hawke, the issue of a treaty was a live issue in the 1980s.
Yeah, I mean, Hawke himself, I think, recognised that this was an area of failure. The Keating government, of course, would have a much stronger legacy, largely through its response to Mabo and with the Native Title Act. But yeah, I mean, there is the government comes to office in 1983 with plans for national land rights. It has the constitutional capacity to do that under the 1967 changes to the Constitution, but it runs into opposition from the Western Australian Labor government of Brian Burke, and very predictably, of course, from the Bjelke-Petersen government in Queensland, from the mining sector. And, really the whole issue is dead in the water by 1984, and the government largely abandons the national land rights issue. As you say, there was also a promise of a treaty that all failed to come to fruition. There were some achievements, I think. The handing back of Ayers Rock of Uluru in 1985 was a very significant symbolic moment. There's a lot of funding during that period for things like Indigenous media, Indigenous health. So it's not that the government is completely inactive, but I think on some of the big ticket issues, it did, it did fall well short of what it was promising when it came to office. And I think that probably speaks to the problems with the Hawke government style of leadership, that sort of corporate or tripartite approach that the unions, business, government type thing that you saw at the National Economic Summit in 1983 was really poorly equipped to bring in, I guess those sections of society, whether we're talking migrants, whether we're talking Indigenous people, the welfare sector, that exercise much less economic clout, that couldn't really be sort of brought into that kind of, sort of more corporate tripartite approach. And I think that Indigenous policy suffered from that.
The other parallels with the Albanese government, there have been, during the first term, there were mounting criticisms that the government wasn't moving too fast enough, that it didn't have some kind of overarching meta narrative. It didn't have an appetite for radical reform, Frank. And these were criticisms made of the Hawke government as well at various points. And some people would charge Albo in particular. Some people would say that Albo's aspiration for Labor to become, and he's been very upfront about this, the natural party of government, has acted to restrain some of his more ambitious ministers and a more ambitious agenda.
Yes, I mean, those similar criticisms and that very phrase, natural party of government, was being used in relation to the Hawke government by the time it wins its third election in 1987. This was being held up as an aspiration and perhaps even an achievement by that stage. So there are parallels, and I think that gives us a sense of proportion in our judgments of the Albanese government, and perhaps a little bit more generosity. A critical difference, Nick, one that's I think gets too little attention in all this, and perhaps it's a part of the answer to why reform has become more difficult for Labor, is the union movement in this. I mean, at the beginning of the 80s, union coverage in this country was still 50%, roughly, of paid workers. Now, today, it's up a little bit from what it was. It's about 13%. If you think about the number of key policy changes and reforms initiatives that came out very directly out of the relationship between the Labor Party and the union movement in the 80s, and I'm thinking here of Medicare, I'm thinking here of superannuation, they had behind them the weight of the union movement. And the reality today is that the union movement can't play that kind of role. It's simply not equipped to play that kind of role. The institutional structures don't even exist and can't exist, I think, for it to play that kind of role. And I suspect that has some really significant implications for how Labor governs now. I think we began to see this under the Gillard-Rudd period, but I think it's even more salient now that Labor governs, perhaps it is a little bit more like the Democratic Party in the United States than the Labor Party was in the 1970s and 80s, where unions are there. They clearly still have a privileged place in the structures of the party, but they're not able to play the incredibly important, positive and constructive role that they were playing, through instruments like the Prices and Incomes Accord in the 1980s.
Can I throw a curveball into this on this front? So I think the current crop of Labor politicians' interpretation of the gravitas of the union movement is wrong. They view it as, yes, as you rightly point out, back in the 80s, 50% union coverage, and now it's 13. But what we know through our research is they do still have an outsized level of trust and influence within the Australian community, but in particular to the group that is contributing to the growth, which is Generation Z. So what I would say here is that perhaps the current crop of politicians are a little bit antiquated in the way they are viewing the union movement and how they should, as the political class, respond to some of the union movement's demands, particularly around intergenerational inequality, which is a massive campaign they are running, and they are going to be obviously advocating for a number of reforms in this space. So I think it's got more asymmetric power now than they had direct power.
Yeah, no, I agree, Kos. I think that's absolutely right. That it's. I mean, in my telling of it, it's what's happened to the unions, but perhaps it's also the way that Labor politicians relate to the union movement.
Yes, that's right.
Say, I can't disagree.
Frank, your impressions to the current environment? It's an environment of deep fragmentation. We're seeing, seismic de-alignment from the major parties. We are seeing aspects of realignment where, the traditional bases of the major parties, to put it crudely, working class and poor voters are now just as likely to vote for the coalition at a federal election. This is certainly borne out by the 2025 data, whereas even in the Hawke heyday, the idea that you would have had Australians on the highest income quintile, the highest incomes, voting for the ALP, the party of the centre left, in higher numbers than the coalition is unthinkable.
Well, it's one of the obvious changes in most of Western democracies, and that is the flip of the educated classes to the left. To some extent, I would slightly differ to your point, Nick. Most of the working class still vote Labor in this country because most of it is brown, diverse. We have a nostalgic view about that working class, and that's, that blue-collar constituency The real working class in 2026 is multicolour, as in multicollar, right? Aged care, health, it's female, right? And that's the new working class, and they in the majority vote Labor or the Greens.
Yes, but I mean the other thing, and you've been tracking this, I've been tracking this. Frank's all over this. Is also education.
Yes.
As the new solid predictor of people's vote. And again, some of the trends you're talking about, Kos, they're appearing particularly in the late 1980s, early 90s. But this is a period also where we're starting to see, and it's very fortunate that the Australian electoral study kicks off in 1987, Frank, as we're starting to see this. But and this came out in the South Australian election. You look at the seats; it's basically the strongest predictor of a higher vote for One Nation was the absence of a tertiary degree.
Well, no, the absence of a university degree.
University degree.
Yes. Basically, the strongest indicator of a One Nation vote is a TAFE or trade qualification, and that's the difference. And the strongest indicator of a Labor vote is a university degree. That was that was writ large in last week's election result.
And here's another critical legacy of the Hawke government, because drastic increases in the number of students going through to year 12 in the 80s.
Yes.
Under the impact of government policy, and then that again very significant expansion of the number of tertiary educated, university educated students coming out of the Dawkins reforms in the late 80s and 1990s. So here is another way, I suppose, in which the modernising impulses of that government have helped to shape where we are at present.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at
back to Whitlam, really.
In all our surveys, those Australians who have not acquired a year 12 qualification are overwhelmingly conservative, and particularly One Nation voters. That's because they're baby boomers. So it goes to your point, right? So basically Gen Xers and younger, their education standards are drastically different to older Australians.
I should say, Frank's written a lot about the 80s and the Labor Party in particular. Frank, we were sort of chatting offline. What's your sense? It does seem we've talked about parallels with the crisis of conservative centre-right politics in the 80s. Is what we're seeing on the centre-right, One Nation displacing the Liberals as the major opposition party according to primary vote, not seats, at the South Australian election? What is your sense of the kind of revolutionary change on the centre-right of politics? Is this unprecedented?
Yes. I mean, it's certainly unprecedented in this form. And the last, kind of hints of a shake-up of this kind occurred in the early 1940s, really. So in that sense, it's unprecedented. Look, I don't know. Historians are no better at predicting the future than anyone else, and they might even be worse.
Oh, Manning and Clark would disagree with that.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Blady too was very big on this sort of stuff, and they often got it wrong. But look, it is possible. As we've talked about, Nick, it is possible, I think, to conceive of a situation going forward where the right at a federal election looks something like this. You have a Queensland regional Conservative Party, the LNP, which will probably be reduced by One Nation incursions, a relatively small remnant Liberal Party, a reduced National Party, again reduced by potentially by incursions from One Nation. So it's a National Party outside Queensland, and One Nation, and that, and of course a number of independents who would be up for supporting or even joining a government of the right if the numbers were there. So that kind of combination facing essentially Labor and the Greens and other independents who are sort of more left-leaning or in the centre. I don't know whether that's where we'll end up, but it is possible, I think, at the moment, in a way that it was probably impossible a year ago to see a future that looks a little bit like that.
Yes, but one of the things about politics which distinguishes itself from the 80s is just the the sense of hyper change.
Yep.
Which is caught up in the media cycle and what I call the permanent presence.
Well, I mean, 80s versus now, good comparison. The major party vote combined in the 80s was well in excess of 90% into the mid 90s. And you fast forward to 2026, and let's predict 2028, it will be the lowest combined vote.
Yeah, the election that foretold the future, I think, Kos, was 1990.
Yes.
That's the one where the Hawke government was returned with a primary vote of less than 40%. I mean, utterly unheard of in Australian federal political history in the decades before. And that I think began to show us what the future might look like.
It was the first time Gen Xers, most of the Gen Xers started to enrol to vote. By that time, we've probably had 4 years or 5 years of Gen X enrolment. Fast forward to now, and they're the most destabilising generation on particularly the right side of politics, but the country in general.
Yeah, the 1990. It's a great point, Frank. I mean, it's Labor Party. The primary slips below 40, and we've now got a situation where the Albanese government won a landslide victory re-election.
Yes.
In 2025 with a primary vote of less than 35%.
Because its opponent collapsed.
Yes, and that's what we saw in South Australia a week ago as well.
And the UK.
I think where did South Australian Labor end up with its primary cause?
39.
Yeah, and it was down.
It was down a little bit, yeah.
A couple of percent.
Yeah. Yeah, basically status quo or decline whilst your opponent collapses. These are the sort of victories that the centre-left side of politics are enjoying at the moment. Until, of course, you have a look at the UK where you start to collapse because someone is eating you up on your left side.
Yes, and I think that's a nice way of sort of rounding out our conversation, Frank. I look at I'm not as cock-a-hoop as many on the Labor side of politics. I can see sort of risks ahead, and I do wonder how much a kind of Hawke-like figure in Peter Malinowskis was able to sort of hold One Nation, hold the sort of One Nation eating away at Labor's vote at bay. When you lose a Hawke-like figure, when you lose a Malinowskis-like figure, when that personal authority fades, then Labor is also at risk of fragmentation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there are many, many dangers. And yes, those northern Adelaide suburbs showed that One Nation does have an appeal in areas of deindustrialisation, intergenerational disadvantage, intergenerational unemployment. There's got to be a lesson in that for the Labor Party nationally going forward.
Indeed. Frank Bongiorno, it's been wonderful. We're out of time. We could chat here for hours talking about the Hawke government, the 80s. We didn't manage to talk about AFL today. Frank could have joined me on the angry Gen X rage against AFL progressivism and postmodernism. Listeners, thank you very much for tuning in. Highly recommend go out, buy Frank's edited book of Carolyn Holbrook and Joshua Black. Both very fine historians in their own right. Gold standard, ? Gold standard. Remembering the Hawke government. It's out today, 1st of April, April Fool's Day. It's not an April Fool's Day joke. It's out with the wonderful New South press. You can get it online or in every fine bookstore. Frank Bongiorno, thank you very much for joining Curtin's cast on our big 50th episode today.
Thanks so much, and it was lovely to be here, and thanks, Kos.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cozzy. Thanks, listeners. We'll see you next week. Ciao, arrivederci.